Okay, so before we jump into this week's Serial Killer Whisperer podcast with Laura Brand, who this week we're gonna have on Dr. Frank Mann, a psychologist out of Stony Brook, to answer a bunch of psychological questions in regards to development of human development, mind development, and how it relates to serial killers. We have to offer a little bit of a correction from last week's podcast regarding William Suff and his Jane Doe victim that was identified by Los Angeles Sheriff's Department a few months ago and has been in the news. So, Cindy.
Okay, so I accidentally said the wrong name. Heather is actually the woman who put Donald Suff in prison last year for the sexual abuse that she endured from him. Her sister Leah was married to Donald Suff, William Suff's brother. So those two names, I accidentally inversed them. So I do apologize for any miscommunication. I wasn't feeling well when we recorded that episode. So please forgive us. Laura was also under the weather a little bit. So we just wanted to put that out there because we do speak to them quite often and we wanted to clarify that.
So with that said, let's jump into this week's podcast with Dr. Frank Mann. All right, so we're back with Laura Brand, and we have a new guest today that we've been talking to for a little bit online, and we have Dr. Frank Mann from Stony Brook University. He's a PhD in psychology. And Frank, thank you for being on the podcast with us today. Thanks, so Frank, tell us a little bit about the work you do and what you study. I mean, you have like a bunch of stuff that you do. I was looking at your LinkedIn page. There's a lot of interesting things that you do in the psychology arena. So why don't you kind of give us a little thumbnail sketch on what you do?
Sure. Yeah. My publication track record is admittedly eclectic, but I'm a differential psychologist, so I study individual differences. And currently I'm a senior research scientist at Stony Brook University, as you mentioned, in the Department of Medicine. Right now, my work primarily focuses on understanding biological, cognitive, social factors that contribute to mental health across the lifespan. So I'm especially interested in relationships between trauma exposure, cumulative stress, and various psychiatric outcomes, including post-traumatic stress disorder, personality disorders, and also mild cognitive impairment and dementia. I'm also interested more generally in how personality and cognitive ability relate to different forms of psychopathology on the one hand, and then also subjective well-being on the other. And I approach these topics using a whole bunch of theories and methods from individual differences psychology, lifespan epidemiology, and applied statistics, and also some quantitative genetics. So I started off my research in graduate school at UT Austin under the guidance of Elliot Tucker-Drob and Paige Hardin, who are both psychologists there at UT. And there, my work really focused on personality risk for antisocial behavior. So focusing on callous, unemotional traits in children and adolescents, and also disinhibited traits like sensation seeking, and how those personality traits kind of combined and intersect with each other, and also with peer and parenting processes to lead individuals to a sort of delinquent set of behaviors.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
I can see why Laura would want to speak to you.
Exactly.
After all of the serial killers that she's been working with for so many years, we talk about this quite often. Like, is it something that can be prevented? Is it something that we can spot in childhood? Is there something we can watch out for? What are the patterns of behavior and clues that we can look at with children so that we can kind of stop these things from happening? Yeah. So I know, Laura, you had a lot of questions for Dr. Mann.
Yeah, what I think is interesting, because like every time we talk with Laura and she talks to these serial killers, I mean, a lot of her time is spent talking about their childhood. And their upbringing and their origin stories of like how they became who they were. They became, serial killers. So it's interesting to kind of get a, kind of a fully kind of scholastic psychological viewpoint of what, what's being done as far as trying to learn where they're, what's causing them to do this. What are the trigger points? Whether, because we're all like these test tube and these vacuums when we're younger, and just all the different elements that we have to kind of deal with, and how does that shape? And how does that shape from one person who goes through a very difficult childhood that none of these things happen to them? They grow up to be they become to a very well-functioning person in society, normal, have a normal life, and then the other person has a similar experience and they turn into a serial killer.
Right.
You know, some people can overcome it, some people can't. So Laura, go ahead. The stage is yours. All right. So Laura, why don't you start off asking him some of the questions that you had for him? Because I know when we've been talking about on other podcasts that we always said we got to get someone on to talk about the psychology of all this. So.
Right. Well, why don't we start with what is callous and unemotional? What are the traits, kind of the stigmas, the myths? Start from like ground zero about it.
Sure. So what are callous and unemotional traits? So we, just like all personality traits, we think of them as sort of like broad behavioral dispositions towards, or tendencies towards thinking, behaving, feeling, acting certain ways. And callous unemotional traits are characterized, of course, as their name suggests, by a lack of empathy, guilt, a lack of emotional sensitivity, and dampened affect or dampened emotional reactivity. So CU traits are usually measured in a research setting using either parent reports, teacher reports, or self-reports of survey items, of essentially symptom checklists. So perhaps the most common scale or questionnaire that's used was developed by Paul Frick, clinical psychologist. It's called the Inventory of Callous and Unemotional Traits. And on that scale, there's 4 subscales that are titled carelessness, uncaring, unemotional, and callous. Right. So with the callous behaviors, we're thinking about behaviors that exhibit essentially a cruel disregard for others. So, someone endorsing an item like, I don't feel remorseful when I do something wrong, that would be an indicator of callousness. Uncaring behaviors, these would be indicated by endorsing statements like the feelings of others are unimportant to me. Unemotional behaviors, things like I don't let my feelings control me. And then carelessness. So not caring about doing things well, essentially, or having tasks completed. So kind of just having this sort of carefree a disregard for others, and the various tasks or goals that you have in mind. But CU traits were actually incorporated into the DSM-5 as what's called a limited pro-social emotions specifier for conduct disorder. So Dr. Frick, in his original conceptualization of CU traits back in the I believe it was late 1990s, early 2000s, described CU traits as essentially analogous to adult conceptualizations of psychopathology. And they're thought to distinguish a particularly severe form of antisocial behavior that is fairly stable or persistent across development. I could add too, as research and theory has progressed, I think it's pretty well accepted now that there's kind of 2 broad variants of callous unemotional traits, usually referred to as primary and secondary variants of CU traits. So the primary variants are thought to be underpinned predominantly by insufficient arousal to emotional cues, where the secondary variants are really thought to develop an adaptation to or as a coping mechanism in response to traumatic exposures. So there's actually a distinction between those primary and secondary variants that's based in part on etiology, right? The hypothesized cause of why that individual is callous and unemotional.
Interesting.
It's very interesting. I have a question. If someone was, if someone's best friend was killed, and the person who was still, let me rephrase this because I haven't had coffee yet, so give me a second. We have an interesting case we've been working on. And if someone's behavior after their best friend dies feels unemotional to many, many people. And there's a potential that this person might know what happened to his best friend. What kind of clues should we look for in his behavior after the death of his best friend? Because something's feeling off to many of us in regards to this boy. And he's only 20. I mean, he's young.
Sure. So when you say clues or cues, for what? For future?
For his behavior, just like his behavior after his best friend was found dead on, in a brutal way. He's been very unemotional publicly, and people are really attacking him for that. And I'm just curious if that could be a normal response for someone, or is that something that we should look deeper into?
Is that a side effect?
Because he's very unemotional, and it comes off a little callous in a lot of his discussions with people, and it unnerves a lot of us because we're not understanding why there's such this lack of emotion when he's talking about his best friend. I mean, this is someone that he grew up with like a brother.
Yeah. So usually when, as psychologists, we make diagnoses and think about long-term prognosis, we try to not focus on any one given behavior, but rather try to capture a constellation of related behaviors, traits, and tendencies. So I wouldn't want to emphasize or focus in too much on a single indicator. But yeah, I mean, I certainly sympathize with your description of that case. I mean, it seems like it's a cause for concern, although, being unemotional or not emotionally reactive, and what would be a typically sort of emotionally salient scenario, if it can be a healthier, normal response to trauma. So, that's part of the CU traits isn't just the U part, right? It's coupled with callousness and aggression and tendencies towards violence. Then this is a very different ballpark that we're playing in, as opposed to, someone who just seems to have some sort of blunt and emotional responses, or maybe doesn't seem quite as upset or sad or mad as one might expect them to be. These things can also vary cross-culturally. I mean, different cultures have different expectations for what it is to be a man, right? And so sort of machismo culture, and that men are supposed to be reserved and hold back their emotions and stay strong in these sorts of traumatic scenarios where other families and cultures might not emphasize that as much. So there can be a whole suite of factors that contribute to and play into why a particular individual is behaving or responding in a given scenario.
Well, hold on one second.
What if they're continuously lying about what happened?
Yeah, that doesn't help. Yeah, so I mean that's going to kind of get us into, we're starting to get into diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. Right. So yeah, repeated deceitfulness is indicated by repeatedly lying, or using an alias or conning others. That is an indicator. It's one of 7 diagnostic criteria, or rather behavioral indicators, that are included among the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. So the more we start adding in behaviors like deceitfulness and lying, you start getting closer and closer to meeting a diagnosis for antisocial personality, which of course is that's the DSM's way. That's the psychologists and psychiatrists lingo, essentially, for saying that someone's a psychopath.
Yeah, I mean, because you can tell as the more this particular person's question, it just, I mean, to me, it's just like when it's obvious to the average person that something seems off, it usually seems off. I think, But I wanted to ask you a question, and independent of that. This callous, unemotional traits in children, is there a specific age where this starts to become more prevalent and you can actually see it? as opposed to not seeing it?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah. So, I mean, it's certainly not going to be identifiable in infancy. But I mean, you can start to see behavioral indicators in early childhood. And it's really their persistence through childhood into adolescence and into early adulthood when it starts really ringing the alarm bells for concern. So that sort of developmental continuity is a part of the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. You need to have exhibited these sort of norm violations, rule-breaking aggressive behavior prior to the age of 15. And then it needs to have persisted past the age of 18 for at least 5 years. So developmental consistency or continuity is baked into the very diagnostic criteria or definition of antisocial personality. So, if you see these things, being not having appropriate emotional responses, lack of emotion regulation and control is normative for children, right? Their brains aren't fully developed yet. And this is true all the way through adolescence. And by adolescence, I don't mean, 13 to 18, but more like 13 to 25.
I was going to say 25 is usually when things level off, don't they? If they've not,
Yeah.
if you don't exhibit those traits at that point, more than likely you're not going to.
You're not going to, yeah, because there's some developmental, or rather neurobiological developmental asymmetry between essentially midbrain regions, the limbic system, and our prefrontal cortex. So adolescents are uniquely situated neurobiologically to be at risk for problematic externalizing behavior because the midbrain, the limbic system, some people kind of playfully refer to it as our reptilian brains, are essentially mature by the age of 16, where the prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing on average until about 25, right? So you have this, the reward center of the brain that's motivating behavior and might lead to sort of disinhibited, impulsive tendencies. That's full-fledged when you're a teenager. But the sort of top-down control, the executive processing, the planning, the emotion regulation that comes from a fully developed prefrontal cortex, we don't have that intact until we're about 25. So you have this window of time, right, with the teenage years between your mid-20s, when there's that developmental asymmetry that puts individuals, broadly speaking, in the population at heightened risk for problematic externalizing behavior. And this is part of the reason that the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder emphasizes that continuity over time, and individuals needing to be over the age of 18, because a lot of the criteria for antisocial personality disorder would be met by teenagers, but it's not because they actually have antisocial personalities. It's that they're in this unique window of development, where, put simply, that their brains aren't fully developed yet, which is why we see this sort of increase in problematic behaviors. So this is indicative of the age crime curve. I don't know if you're familiar with that empirical phenomenon, but if you look at criminal behaviors, criminal convictions, both in terms of violent crimes and nonviolent crimes, there's a massive age trend, where prior to the age of 13, 14, 15, it's quite low. And you see this big, massive peak in adolescence, and then it kind of gradually declines into later adulthood. So this isn't a trend that's following an individual, but rather capturing individual differences in a population. So this is to say the majority of crimes that are committed by teenagers and young adults. And then that peters off in later adulthood. And this age crime curve is at least partly thought to reflect that developmental neurobiological asymmetry that I was mentioning there. That's the sort of working hypothesis for why we see that age crime curve so highly replicated across so many different samples and populations.
Is there a gender differentiation, like between males and females, that trajectory that you just kind of illustrated?
Yeah. So, if you compare averages and just overlap distributions for various types of delinquent and criminal behaviors for males and females, I think most people are shocked by how much the distributions overlap, because there's usually a big emphasis on there being gender differences, and that, men tend to be worse offenders, and there are statistically significant average differences, but the distributions primarily overlap. But what you see is at the very tail ends of these skewed distributions, usually antisocial and criminal behavior doesn't really take on a nice, neat, normal distribution. It's usually positively skewed. It's very often even left censored or zero inflated. So there's a whole bunch of people who aren't committing any crimes and aren't delinquent at all. And then the tail ends of these distributions peter out. And it's at the tail ends of the distributions that we see the biggest differences, right? So although there's a slight average difference, if you look at, say, out of 1,000 people, the 10 who are the most violent, they're almost always going to be males. Similar to if you take 1,000 people and say, okay, who are the 10 worst criminal offenders or the 10 most delinquent children, they're almost always going to be males. And those, as you can see, it's the behaviors at sort of the extreme tail ends of the distribution that are going to land people in prison or, lead someone to interact with a juvenile justice system. So that's why we see such stark sex and gender differences and incarceration rates, right? It's not really about what's going on at the average or the central tendencies of the distribution. It's what's going on at the extreme tail ends of the distribution. And I've seen this in a number of data sets that I've worked with, where if you overlap the distributions of your antisocial behavioral measure, the means are pretty close together, but then you look out at the tail and you see that the majority of those that are at the really high end of that behavioral continuum are predominantly male.
Interesting. Laura, you have anything? You're on mute again.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's all fascinating. I've been reading a lot of studies that, we found that we can actually teach empathy early on.
Oh,
you guys there?
Yep.
Oh, it just glitched for a second.
Okay, repeat your question.
Oh, I said, I've been reading a lot of studies that we can actually teach empathy when they're young, if they have the callous unemotional traits. Have you come across any research of that?
Yeah, there was a well done meta-analysis, I believe it was 2023, that did support the general idea that children with CU traits can show reductions in antisocial behavior and other disruptive externalizing behaviors in response to treatment, which is great news. But they also tend to begin treatment and end treatment with worse symptoms and more problematic behavior than children who don't have CU traits. So yes, this meta-analysis suggests that on average, when we treat kids with CU traits who have comorbid conduct problems, on average, you do see a treatment effect on reducing those conduct problems. Interestingly, though, this meta-analysis also showed that there wasn't a reduction in the CU traits themselves, but rather a reduction in the comorbid conduct problems. So, of course, like all studies and meta-analyses, it's complicated. They also found a number of moderating factors. So the average effect on CU traits distinguished from the conduct problems, because they so often bleed together. They're so often comorbid. But if we disentangle the two and say that we have CU traits, which we think are ultimately undergirding many of the conduct problems, and then you put these kids with conduct problems in treatment, and then you have other kids with conduct problems who are also in treatment, but they don't have high CU traits. As I mentioned, these treatments are effective at reducing the conduct problems in children both with and without CU traits, but not so effective at least on average, at mitigating the CU traits themselves, but I mentioned moderating factors. So significant treatment-related reductions in CU traits, they were found to be more pronounced for parenting-focused interventions as opposed to other forms of interventions. And then there were also some sort of methodological moderators. So studies that used parent-reported measures of CU traits as opposed to self-reports or informant reports, they tended to show a better standardized mean difference after the intervention. Also, studies conducted outside the United States had better efficacy rates or remission rates for reducing CU traits. And also studies for which less than half of the sample was a racial or ethnic minority group also seemed to have better average response to treatment than those that had a more diverse sample composition. And as to what is ultimately driving these moderating factors, it's going to be some complex constellation of variables that are still up for discussion and research. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well, Laura, I mean, the question I have for you, Laura, that you can kind of relate to him, as far as you dealing with the amount of, serial offenders that you deal with, and you really kind of delve into their childhoods and their backgrounds. I mean, you spend a lot of time talking to these individuals. Mm-hmm. How does this, based upon what Frank is talking about, how much does it come into play with the offenders that you're talking to? And is it just one component?
Wait, before we do that though, can we just clarify what the CU traits are?
So, right. So we're talking about the cruel disregard for others, being uncaring or careless. So not caring about the feelings of others, not valuing or doing things well, essentially. So that would be getting at like sort of the careless features, and then the unemotional features, either having blunted emotional responses themselves or just essentially not letting your emotions control you or drive your behaviors.
Why are they called CU traits?
Callous, unemotional.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just want to clarify that for the audience.
Yeah, he said that in the beginning.
No, I know, but.
So, Laura, I mean, of the people at your, obviously, I would imagine a lot of the serial offenders kind of fall under this classification.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the ones that I talked to, I mean, they grew up in the 40s, so there wasn't a lot of research back then, and people weren't able to recognize it like we do now. He was diagnosed as a teenager with a passive-aggressive personality disorder.
Who was this? You broke up just a little bit. You disappeared there for a second. Who?
Oh, Bittaker was diagnosed with a passive-aggressive personality disorder when he was in his teenage years.
And how about some of the others?
They didn't have treatment. I mean, they would go to juvie, but, that was it.
Well, not so much as treatment but based upon what you've learned from them, obviously, and they didn't have the studies and information back then, but basically from the sampling that you're talking to, how many fall under this category, or do they all fall under this category?
Do they all exhibit CU traits, the ones that you've been talking to?
The majority, I would say. Yeah. It starts, in childhood, the behavioral problems, usually around 12 or 13 is what they start getting into, break the law, committing crimes around that age. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Reflective of that age crime curve.
Yeah.
Something I should add too so I don't want to discourage the potential efficacy of interventions to treat CU traits. And you could say, well, how can you say that? You just mentioned that a meta-analysis from 2023 showed that on average, interventions might reduce the comorbid conduct problems, but not the CU traits themselves. Yes, I did just say that, but I think it's important to contextualize the fact that meta-analytic estimates are averages. They're weighted averages across many, many studies. Okay, so not only do you have variation across studies, but these averages also aren't reflecting the many individual differences within a given study. Okay, so you can have a study that's run, you can compare symptom severity or some other indicator for treatment efficacy before and after a treatment for different groups of people. You can compare those groups and you can get a mean difference in treatment response across those two groups. If the difference isn't different, significantly different than zero, we'd say that on average, the treatment isn't effective. But this belies individual differences that are contributing to that mean difference. So although in a particular sample or group of people, the average treatment effect might not be significant, that doesn't mean that there weren't any people in that treatment group that didn't show reductions in the traits. It just means that on aggregate together, the average treatment effect doesn't meet the bar for efficacy, right? So although average treatment effects might not be significantly statistically significant for reducing CU traits, that doesn't mean that there's not a single kid within that study that showed improvements in emotion recognition and processing that would help to lower those CU traits. It's just on aggregate at the whole, the trend isn't different from zero.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, it just seems like now more than ever, we're really kind of learning about that period of time because, obviously, in addition to the work that Laura's doing with, these serial offenders and a lot of everything they talk about is that, those first moments when they are teenagers or even sometimes preteens where they're actually committing some crimes, some pretty heinous crimes that you find out later on that kind of basically solidifies these CU traits even more, because they do it and they don't know why they do it. And so they kind of they shut down even more, and it makes it more easier for them to do it another time because they didn't really have an emotional reaction the first time and they didn't really feel anything. I mean, Laura, did some of the offenders, do they talk about their experience? And I think we touched on this, what their experience and what they felt after that first initial, whether it was a killing or a crime or anything that they knew that they broke the law, and did they describe how they felt? Does it fall within does that kind of match up?
Yeah. I would say a lot of them describe it as a thrill. And, that's indicative of antisocial personality. CU is getting that thrill, the thrill-seeking behavior. So, yeah. And they'll report that to me around, say, in preteen years, teenage years, even younger sometimes, too.
Yeah, it's because, the main thing that when we talk about this, as far as trying to learn and figure out why people do this, why they're the serial killers, why people kill, why people, and we just had like another, mass shooting
from a 14-year-old
yesterday. So it's like, what is, and the other big question is, we've talked about this before. I mean, it doesn't really apply to, and I don't know how much it applies to a lot of the serial offenders that Laura's talking to, and maybe it does, but the play in, drugs and SSRIs and how, at an early young age does that come into, how does that affect these CU traits, or does it affect it at all, or, how does that come into play? Because we've heard a lot and read a lot about, a lot of these serial offenders or these serial shooters, these young kids doing this, is that they've been on SSRIs.
Yeah, so there's no FDA approved pharmacological treatments for CU traits, for antisocial personality disorder, or for any personality disorder for that matter. What you do see is use of pharmacological interventions to treat comorbid psychiatric problems. And and problems that in previous diagnostic sort of classification systems would have been referred to as axis 1 diagnoses. So depression, anxiety are the real big ones. And of course, we would see MAOIs or SSRIs prescribed to treat those comorbid problems. If anyone's prescribing medications specifically to treat CU traits or antisocial personality disorder, then they're going off label.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but I mean that is one of the sort of primary modes for treating CU traits, is to not, at least pharmacologically, isn't to focus or even try to focus on the CU traits. It's to try to treat the comorbid problems. If you can help improve someone's anxiety and depression who's also suffering from CU traits and sort of some tendencies toward conduct disorder, this does seem to help their overall picture. Because psychiatric comorbidity is the norm, it's not the exception. So there's, I don't know if you've ever heard the sort of 50% rule of thumb. So individuals who are diagnosed with a psychiatric disorder at some point in their life, roughly 50% of those will also meet the diagnostic criteria for a second mental disorder at some point in their life. Among those who meet the diagnostic criteria for 2 mental disorders across their life, about 50% of them will actually meet diagnostic criteria for 3 mental disorders. Among those who meet diagnostic criteria for 3, about 50% will meet diagnostic criteria for 4, right? So this is the general 50% rule of psychiatric comorbidity. Of course, if you look at, it is a general rule of thumb. I'm working with rough numbers here. If you look at large-scale prevalence studies of comorbid psychiatric conditions, the numbers don't match the 50% rule precisely, but they do follow that general trend, which is why that rule of thumb was coined. So I mean, that's my guess for why, just like the case you mentioned, and you say, oh, it seems like so many of these kids are on SSRIs. It's most likely because they're being treated for a comorbid, formerly referred to as axis 1 diagnosis of depression or anxiety. Right, the medication wasn't itself prescribed to treat conduct disorder or CU traits, and that this isn't actually abnormal. It's quite common for people with personality disorders to have other diagnoses and to have those diagnoses treated, since there isn't anything on the book to, at least pharmacologically, to treat any personality disorder, including antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting when Laura was working with Bittaker, and towards the end of his life, he started to emote in a lot of the conversations that she had with him. And we've always had this discussion. Is it possible that someone like him, who has all these CU traits, could learn empathy or exhibit empathy towards the end of his life? I mean, it was just really interesting for us. We were trying to understand why that was happening. He kept trying, and it sounded like he was remorseful in some of the things. Laura, I mean, obviously you can speak to that more than me, but just from the recordings that I've heard.
Yeah, because she had a continuum of time there that she was working with him. But so we saw, and she recorded all these conversations, so you actually can hear the change in his voice from when the first time she started working with him till literally right up until his death. And there's definitely an arc where,
or is that another CU trait that they can manipulate even through pretending to be empathetic?
Yeah, so I mean, that's of course a possibility. That sounds to me more like not necessarily indicative of CU traits, but more broadly of antisocial personality disorder, right? Mm-hmm. They tend to be manipulative and for the purpose of, profit, power, gratification, or depicting themselves in a positive sort of light. So yeah, I mean, that remains a possibility, and without hearing the tapes and knowing the details of the case myself, it's hard to say. I mean, but I don't. Maybe he found Jesus, as he reached the end of his life. Who knows?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
What are some of the environmental factors and societal factors that come into play with CU with people like growing up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So couched within this distinction between, primary and secondary variants of CU traits, right? The primary variant is just essentially defined as a blunted emotional reactivity or inability to pick up on emotional cues, where the secondary variant is thought specifically to be an adaptation or coping mechanism or sort of response to extreme childhood neglect and abuse. And undoubtedly, there are cases of antisocial personality coupled with CU traits that seems to have a clear origin in a horrific childhood. That said, there was a meta-analysis done looking at the association between childhood abuse and neglect and CU traits, and it found a correlation of about 0.23 between CU trait severity and the presence or absence of abuse and neglect in childhood. And if you square that correlation, you get what's called the coefficient of determination, or the percent of variance explained. And 0.23 squared is about 5 to 6%, right? So this suggests that childhood abuse and neglect are explaining about 5 to 6% of the individual differences we see in CU traits in the population. So although it's a statistically significant contributing factor, it's not explaining 50% of individual differences. It's not explaining 25% of individual differences. It's statistically significant, but in the ballpark of moderate to small effect sizes in social and behavioral science. So this tells us that it's a contributing factor, but it's by no means the only contributing factor, right? So there's a lot of other hypothesized and sort of scantily researched factors. So neighborhood factors, being in sort of a low SES, high crime, unpredictable, stressful environment, peer relations. So both taking the form of being tormented or bullied by your peers, or also not necessarily being bullied, but just affiliating with and befriending other deviant peers are both risk factors for CU traits and antisocial behavior. It seems like there's at least some evidence that maternal smoking, alcohol, substance use is a contributing factor, which makes sense, right? It's going to lead to a more unstable, unpredictable, stressful home environment for children. There are also malnourishment in childhood or malnourishment of the mother during pregnancy, stress and anxiety and other prenatal stressors. Some have suggested that there's potentially exposure to heavy metals in early childhood could be a contributing factor. And also parental psychopathology is a big risk factor, both because we inherit our genes from our parents, so we're getting some heritable risk. When you have a parent who has some sort of psychiatric diagnosis, and also because it's going to just further contribute to the stress in the home environment. So it's
it's a lot. There's a lot of things going on.
It's a confluence of a lot of different factors. Yeah. And, the state of the empirical science right now is, I'd say probably the most studied environmental risk factor would be childhood abuse and neglect. I mean, to the extent now that, we have had a meta-analysis done. So that tells you that there's at least a dozen or so or more studies. These other factors, I think, are less well studied, but there's at least some preliminary evidence for them. But time will tell how robust and strong those effects are as research continues. There's also a lot of sort of inherent difficulties and obstacles with studying these sorts of things. So with children, they can't give written and informed consent. So you need to get the parents' consent in order for it to be ethically permissible. And then once they get into adulthood, many of them end up in prison. And now Laura can speak to the difficulty of getting in contact with folks in prison and, doing case studies. I'm sure she can speak to how incredibly challenging and difficult that can be. And now can you imagine trying to do some large prison population based study with a couple thousand defenders? And I mean, just logistically, it becomes really, really difficult. And increasingly difficult for institutional review boards, the ethical review committees that approve or disapprove of studies at institutions. It's harder to get your study passed by your IRB and deemed ethically approvable to even do the research once you have these special at-risk populations.
Yeah. Laura, can you talk a little bit about that, about like the difficulty of getting, like, I mean, obviously you get full discovery on all these serial offenders, and obviously they've all been, psychologically evaluated, and, how hard is it to really kind of get that information and kind of boil down, what the nexus of what motivated these serial killers to do what they were doing, even at an early age.
Yeah. So I was going to say, well, when I started the collective study, it was so challenging. You have to get this large pool in prison who have antisocial personality, get them to sit down, answer very deep questions, 75 of them. It was very extremely hard to do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to determine whether or not the answers to those questions are even valid. I mean, because you're just going based upon, are they being deceptive? Are they being, are they just telling you what you want to hear?
The study weeds out any manipulation. Like, the questions are designed to weed it out. I wanted to develop a study that could help, and anybody in the field who has to work with these offenders to kind of sidestep the manipulation. So the questions are geared towards, them answering it in an authentic fashion, such as there's no right or wrong answer in the study. So there's really no way they can actually manipulate it.
Yeah. The other question I had for you, Frank, is that, you said that some of the problems are the fact that obviously, these children are children, and their parents have to consent to do these things. I mean, I think that's a pretty big gap there, because like a lot of times parents don't see, and, at least they don't notice a lot of these, they may not notice these traits at home, or they just they're kind of oblivious to them, but educators will kind of discover them sometimes before parents, because they spend a lot of time with them. They're testing them constantly, just regular tests and stuff. So it reveals to themselves. So you have that barrier as well of, I guess my question is, what kind of systems in the educational system that can be put into place to kind of identify these things in young people, but at the same time, don't make the kids feel like they're being stigmatized because of it? Because, I know, when I was younger, I had some learning, they thought I had some learning disabilities. I'm sure I had ADHD or something like that, because I was just bored in classroom. So they would constantly take me out of class at least once a week to test me. And it always made me feel, strange and bad and isolated. And I'm like, what's wrong with me? And they, why do they take me out of class? So does that can that contribute to a young person's perception of themselves and kind of accentuate these CU traits if they're being kind of looked at under a microscope?
Yeah, I mean, the unemotional component of the CU traits themselves suggests that they shouldn't care too much about how they're being singled out. But
That's interesting.
I certainly sympathize with your own story, and yeah, I mean, there's more effective way. So presumably they were giving you some sort of ADHD screener or a screener for like a developmental disability, which is a little bit more involved. But the CU traits are pretty. I mean, it's simple and in a sense kind of rudimentary, as is most of psychiatry, right? It's descriptive, it's behavioral. So, you could have parents and teachers complete an inventory of callous and unemotional traits, just a relatively short sort of multiple choice checklist survey. And you could have them complete this with student evaluations, right? Because this is something they do with their students anyways. And that would be a inconspicuous way that the schools can screen for these things, and of course alert the parents and notify them that, hey, you had a teacher who indicated really high levels of CU traits, and these the surveys are internally consistent and they show good reliability in terms of overtime retest reliability. So they're valid instruments. And they have different versions, parent versions and teacher or informant report versions. And this seems to me a way of screening for these problems that are low cost and also, don't have the risk of stigmatizing youth amongst their peers, because, the kids aren't going to know what the parents and teachers said on the surveys. It can be done confidentially and in a private manner. So then you don't have the discomfort and social awkwardness of singling out a kid and pulling them out of class over and over again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. They could do it. I mean, that makes sense. Like, the teacher's with them all day. Yeah. They can give them these, random questionnaires, and it's probably very easy for the teachers to spot the CU traits after spending time with them.
And it's not, it's not hundreds and hundreds of questions. Right. A teacher can complete an inventory on callous unemotional traits probably in 3 to 5 minutes for each kid, and that's if they're being thoughtful.
If
they want to whip through it because they say, oh, this kid's fine. This kid's zeros for everything. He's bright, full of joy and alacrity, So yeah, even if you were being thoughtful, it might take 3 to 5 minutes.
Can you give us like an example of a couple examples of questions that would be on a survey like that would kind of elicit the test for CU traits? Like, what would be on a question like that?
Yeah. So, I'm trying to think of.
Are they like scenarios? Like, if you saw a wounded cat on a street or anything like that, or is it anything like that, or what is it?
No, it's not. It isn't as sort of. It's not that sophisticated, or it's not that narrative, I guess is a better word.
Okay.
I mean, it's pretty straightforward questions. So usually you get those sort of narrative or more lengthy descriptive questions when you're worried about demand characteristics. So some sort of feature about the survey or instrument that would alert the person responding, particularly in the case of self-reports, that would lead to socially desirable responding, right? So you don't want your participants or the subjects of the survey saying, oh, I can tell from these items what these people are trying to assess. It's something that's bad, so I'm going to lie about it and, make myself look like a socially desirable responder, right? So that's usually when you get, it's those types of surveys where you get that more, the more descriptive narrative sort of question that you just outlined. In the inventory of CU traits, an uncaring item is just the sentence, the feelings of others are unimportant to me. If it was a self-report, or if it was a teacher report, like the feelings of others are unimportant to him or her, right? And just a Likert scale, not at all like this person, in the middle, not alike or unalike, or, a 5 would be very much alike this person. Unemotional item from the ICU would be he or she does not let their feelings control them. Right. So there's no hypothetical long narrative of, oh, well, you come across a injured puppy and, or you come across some child who's in need and asking for help. How would you respond? It's not open format like that. It's much more highly structured. And this enables, you don't get as much nuance. You don't pick up on sort of idiosyncrasies that might be telling for a particular person, but you do get a standardized response scale. It allows or better enables analysis of these sort of individual differences in large samples, where it becomes much more difficult to find ways to sort of standardize unstructured open responses to questions.
That's interesting.
So for kids that do show signs of the CU traits, what would you suggest to those parents
And educators.
and educators?
Yes. Yeah, so there are parent-child interactive therapies, sometimes called like adapted parenting programs, that try to emphasize a system of rewards and sort of positive consequences to improve behavior. Generally, the goals of these sort of parent-child interactive therapy or adapted parenting programs are to create a warm and emotionally responsive sort of parent-child dynamic, to try to avoid punishment-based strategies of parenting and focus more on reward-based strategies. So de-emphasizing positive and negative punishment and emphasizing positive reinforcement. And then focusing on trying to increase sort of parent-child affiliation, working on eye contact, and training children to better recognize and understand emotions in themselves and in others. And then broadly trying to focus on just activities that enhance moral emotions or socially acceptable behaviors. So, there's not a single prong, that's a multi-pronged approach that these sort of interventions try to take. But that's the sort of general flavor or theme that you get when you look at what's going on in these adapted parenting programs.
When you say like activities, like what are you talking? Can you kind of give it like kind of an example of like do you have them in social groups,
Yeah.
athletics,
Sure.
things that are going to help either allow them to kind of bond with other people and also see how other children react emotionally to things, so they can kind of almost, because like when we're kids, we parrot our friends a lot of times. We mimic emotions and things. We want to be we want to be like our friends. So the kids will hang out together. They'll do the same things. They'll say the same things. So is that the types of things, kind of activities to kind of help them, jar them out of these CU kind of web of active things?
Yep. That's you hit the nail on the head. Just sort of socialization, basically. Just trying to get these kids more socialized. Because ultimately, I mean, when you go back to the original conception of antisocial personality disorder way back in 1968 with the release of the DSM-2, the diagnosis was said to be reserved for individuals who are broadly unsocialized and violate social norms. It goes on to say that, and they tend to be selfish and callous and irresponsible and impulsive and capable of loyalty and guilt and so on. And later editions of the DSM, you start getting what we understand now as more formal diagnostic criteria. But I mentioned this sort of historical anecdote because, we've known that, they mentioned callous in the original description of antisocial personality disorder way back when in 1968. And in many ways, the criteria and our understanding descriptively of the disorder has changed very little since then.
Yeah, callous, you can feel it, and it doesn't feel, something's off when people are callous about things, especially when their best friend dies. That one bothers me a lot.
Yeah.
Well, this has been incredibly interesting, and thank you.
I think we have what you've done is you kind of stirred up a lot of questions for us. So we may have to have you back on to kind of to talk about this, because I can tell Laura's kind of she's simmering there, and I think she's going to have a lot of, because normally, she's kind of processing this and kind of putting it through her kind of program in her head, because now she's kind of, I can see she's kind of going through her Rolodex of all her serial offenders, trying to piece together,
Yeah.
like, whether or not this stuff is really applicable. But, you know, I mean, to me, it's like, my last question to you is what's the difference between this type of CU traits? Is it kind of, does it go across the spectrum in all kind of humanity, or is there some countries that kind of handle it better than others? I mean, you know, I think we're at a pivotal point here in our country where, you know, there's a lot of study being done, child development, you know, with, you know, the youth of today have been in a test tube of craziness, dealing with the COVID and the, you know, and the social media explosion, and a lot of things that, you know, none of us had to deal with in our formative years. It's, how much do you think that is that going to either make it CU traits even more prevalent, or does it give us an opportunity to kind of explore it and remedy it?
Yeah, probably yes and no. So to the extent that someone has CU traits as a secondary variant, and that it's a sort of adaptive or coping mechanism, adaptive response or coping mechanism to an adverse environment, and who haven't developed sufficient emotion recognition skills. One could imagine how the requirement to wear masks for a year or two is certainly not going to help children who are already struggling with emotion recognition, right? It's only going to make that worse. On the other hand, you know, a lot of the research that I did on CU traits had to do with its heritability and how antisocial behavior is more highly heritable among children with CU traits. So, you know, I think back to Dr. Vitting over in the UK has done some excellent work on this. She found that I believe it was children as young as 7 and 9 that conduct problems are more highly heritable when there is the presence of CU traits. And then some of the work that I did kind of extended that finding and added another distinction between aggressive and rule-breaking behavior, and found that indeed adolescents, as well as children, do exhibit a more highly heritable form of antisocial behavior when it's coupled with CU traits, but it seems to be the aggressive antisocial sort of subtype of behaviors as opposed to the non-aggressive rule-breaking behaviors, for which the heritability is magnified for kids with CU traits. So that is to say, a lot of the risk factors that we're getting, which are increasingly being confirmed with genome-wide association studies, and previously were identified using pedigree or family and twin studies to get these heritability estimates. You know, they're factors that we get from our parents through a genetic lottery. You know, at the time of gamete formation, we get a random assortment of genes from both of our parents, and a substantial degree of the liability or risk for CU traits is inherited. It's a matter of bad luck in the genetic lottery. But I don't want that to lead individuals to think that this therefore means that they're immutable or unchangeable, right? Just because something is highly heritable doesn't mean that it's fixed forever or that it's not amendable to treatment or therapy, right? I mean, poor eyesight's probably the most clear-cut example of that. Poor eyesight's heritable, right? It runs in families. There's a big genetic risk factors for having poor eyesight, but it doesn't mean that we can't intervene. I have an intervention that you can see on my head right now, right? It works quite.
We talk about inheriting from your parents, but it's not only that; it even goes even further. That you inherited from your parents and also from their parents and their parents, because like it's like a whole. Because you know sometimes like they say sometimes the traits skip a generation. You know, where like you may not be just like your father, but you act exactly like your grandfather, and you have a lot of the same traits as your grandfather. So it can even go across, it gets kind of spread through even that, I would think. So
yeah, and I also hope that this realization can relieve parents of maybe what is a false sense of responsibility, right? Because there's all this emphasis on early childhood environments and unpredictable environments and stress and bad parenting and neglect and abuse. But as I just mentioned, we had a meta-analysis in 2023 that showed that about 5 to 6% of the variation in CU traits is due to childhood neglect and abuse. And depending on the study, in the presence of high CU traits, antisocial behavior is 50 to 60% heritable. So, this combined with, there's a history of this in psychiatry. So it was long thought that schizophrenia was due to cold, neglectful parenting. And we now know that that's not true at all, right? Schizophrenia is a very, very highly heritable disorder. So there have been times in the past when a sort of preliminary or cursory understanding of a psychiatric phenomenon has led society broadly to blame parents when the blame is not with them, and I do worry that we might be doing something similar when it comes to CU traits by emphasizing the early childhood environment and neglect and abuse so much. Then, well, you end up with a parent who sees their kid has some conduct problems. They seem to be a little callous and unemotional. And then they start thinking, oh gosh, what did I do wrong? Right? Like it must be me who messed up my kid some way, because, that's what all the emphasis and discussion is on, is early childhood environments and parenting and abuse. And so, I hope your listeners that have tuned in today who might be having those kids can also just say, yeah, it also might not be my fault as the parent. It might just be bad luck, right? Like they just, bad luck in the genetic lottery. But again, keeping in mind, that doesn't mean that your kid's not going to get any better. It doesn't mean that there's no hope, because just because something's genetic, it doesn't mean that it's not changeable or we can't intervene to improve it. Most things have some heritable component in terms of human behavior, emotion, cognition. But it doesn't mean that there's no hope for change.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, because a lot of times you feel like we're dealing with all these horrific serial killer stories and Laura's study, and it just you think it's just were these people, these killers, are they just bad seeds? Were they born bad seeds? Was it nature versus nurture? That's what we're always trying to figure out. What was it in their past and their upbringing that triggered them to all these different traits, and the CU traits, the antisocial behavior that kind of led to them and made them want to experiment by killing someone for the first time and realizing, oh, I can do this again, and I can do this again, and I can do this until they eventually get caught. And then they're, and then you're like, oh, then we got to look at these people. It's like we're always, a lot of the times we're kind of not reverse engineering it. We're just trying to figure out, we're always in after the fact. Well, what made them do this? Like, I think that's the biggest thing that what Laura's trying to do is just through her study and talking to these extremely disturbed people, like, as far as what can we learn from them to kind of at least find the warning signs. And the same things with the CU traits in young people here. What are these traits? Because no one's been able to really crack that nut yet, because you can't study everybody all the time every time, so everybody's going to be isolated. So it's not until we get them into that test tube in a quote unquote prison environment where they can't do anything, and you have them under a microscope. So I think I don't know what the future is for that as far as being able to kind of prevent that, but I don't, but I do think both the work you're doing and the work that Laura's doing is kind of laying the foundation to kind of come up with some sort of roadmap so we can kind of identify these things. I think, like in these school shooters, I mean, we had one in my daughter's high school, and it's like they seem to be identifiable beforehand. There are warning signs, there are things that you can kind of like pinpoint, and And I know you can't pinpoint every of them, and it's just that's a whole nother conversation in itself, trying to identify this and label someone that could be a potential problem and do something that's horrific. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think the work that both you and Laura are doing is integral in at least trying to find out some answers.
Yeah. I think, you mentioned that this is a nut that we have yet to crack. I like that phrasing. I think that part of the reason of our inability to crack this nut more so than we have is that it might be due to some sort of misconceptions or myths about antisocial personality disorder. This idea that it necessarily means violence, or it's somehow synonymous with serial killer, or that it's even the most useful way to distinguish, describe, or categorize people who exhibit delinquent, criminal, or otherwise problematic externalizing behavior. So, the diagnostic criteria in the DSM, you can have essentially no overlap in behavioral indicators and be diagnosed with the same disorder. So if you have to meet 4 out of 7 criteria, well, then there's one, I guess, that's overlapping, right? But you can have people with the same diagnosis, but who have very different behavioral indicators. And in psychiatric research or research on developmental psychopathology, there are more useful distinctions, I think, out there than just a binary diagnosis of whether or not someone meets the criteria for antisocial personality. I mean, first, I think it's probably just wrong to think about these people as sort of categorically distinct from others in the population. I don't think that people with antisocial personality disorder are a discrete class of individuals or a natural taxon. I think they lie on a continuum in the population, and that it might be more accurate and more helpful to think about psychopathology as essentially extreme, unique combinations and manifestations of otherwise healthy and normal tendencies and ways of behaving. So we all have personalities. We can be described continuously as high or low on a wide range of different traits. And people that we currently diagnose with antisocial personality disorder have a sort of unique combination of extremes on these personality trait continua, but aren't really categorically distinct from other humans, or a rather natural human variation. It's just the extreme ends of that natural human variation that is leading individuals to commit these behaviors or commit these acts. And as I mentioned, I think there's more useful distinctions empirically for identifying really bad sort of long-term prognosis for criminal or delinquent behavior. So we have early onset versus late onset. This is an empirical distinction you see in a lot of studies that is a useful sort of modifying factor. Are behaviors aggressive, or are they non-aggressive rule breaking? Right? You can get a diagnosis for conduct disorder for a child, and it can all essentially be non-aggressive rule breaking behaviors. You can have another child who's diagnosed with conduct disorder who's exhibiting aggressive and violent behavior. So is the important distinction whether or not the child has this diagnosis of conduct disorder? Maybe not so much. Maybe the more important distinction is, are the behaviors that are getting them the diagnosis aggressive behaviors, or are they non-aggressive sort of rule-breaking behaviors? That might be a better predictor for how they're going to fare long-term in terms of their life outcomes than just whether or not they meet the criteria for a diagnosis. And then the other distinctions the other two that you see a lot in empirical literature, right? There's early versus late onset. There's aggressive versus non-aggressive rule breaking. Another distinction, which we've talked about quite a bit today, is the presence or absence or CU traits, or being really high or being really low on CU traits. And then a distinction between life course persistent or sort of adolescent limited behavior. So delinquency and risk-taking behavior is really common in adolescence.
Yeah.
And for most people, it stays in adolescence. They age out of it, right?
They grow out of it. They grow out of it.
Yeah. And it's just a subset of individuals who really show this sort of life course persistent, to steal terminology from Moffat, this life course persistent behavior. And these distinctions, early, late onset, aggressive, non-aggressive, CU traits or non-CU traits, life course persistent or adolescent limited, they seem to map onto each other, right? So the early onsetters tend to be the more aggressive behaviors. They tend to have CU traits, and these are the individuals who tend to have that life course persistent pattern. Where the late, and by late onset, I mean adolescence as opposed to childhood, but the late onset individuals who have low CU traits, they tend to exhibit more non-aggressive rule-breaking behaviors that tend to also be limited to adolescence. So these are the sort of empirical distinctions that have been proven to be useful empirically for predicting long-term outcomes, for distinguishing developmental trajectories. So shifting of our focus away from these binary diagnostic categories of either you are or you aren't an antisocial person, to these more empirically grounded distinctions, again, early, late onset, aggressive or non-aggressive, high or low CU traits, and is it adolescent limited or is it life course persistent? That those distinctions are going to be more useful not only for understanding long-term course, but also aiding in continued research and continuing to broaden our understanding of the causes and correlates and consequences of these sorts of behaviors.
Wow. That's a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I felt like I just took a class here.
And it was great. It was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it
This
is.
has been wonderful. We'll definitely want to talk to you again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed coming on and chatting with you. And yeah, don't hesitate to reach out if you think of other questions or.
Oh yeah, trust me, we're going to have a lot more questions because now that we kind of know exactly what your field of study is and how you look at things. And I think Laura will echo this, is that it because we're always looking for new tools to kind of look at these criminals and find out, well, why'd they do this? What made them do that? And a lot of what you're talking about kind of solidifies some of the things that Laura's been looking into and gives, it makes sense. It starts making sense. You start going back and you're going, well, this makes sense now. Yeah. This is why this person did this. But thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mann. Okay.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was a pleasure.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Take care.
Bye, guys.